Again, I welcome you all to this session looking at the opportunity for adopting e-bikes at scale, its impact, and what cities should be thinking about to harvest the biggest potential from e-bikes that benefit the cities, the environment, and the people. And of course, as the title suggests, e-bikes can facilitate compact cycling cities, but we'll hear from the presenters that cities need to address a number of hurdles such as infrastructure design, regulation, financing, as well as big picture planning around urban mobility. So do head over to the link in the chat if you want to download the publication. I'm dropping it right now in the chat. There's a lot of information, and our panelists also will touch on a few key things from it. So we'll start the session with a brief framing from Dana Yanoka, a senior research manager at ITDP Global. Hello, Dana. She's the author of the report and will set the conversation with some brief points around benefits of e-bikes at scale, barriers to e-bike uptake, and key recommendations. Then we'll hear from two respondents bringing the perspective of their region. First, Deliani, who also goes by Anggi Siregar. Hello, Anggi. She's an urban planner working at ITDP Indonesia office on a number of initiatives like active transport and the interdisciplinary gender lens. She'll talk about the situation in Indonesia and efforts around creating e-bike standards for commercial and personal use. And then we'll hear from Christine Yakona, transport system specialist from ITDP Africa, who will talk about how 3 different cities in Africa are approaching e-bikes, looking at the e-mobility ecosystem and public-private partnerships, just to name a few. So with that, I just wanted to welcome you all, and I will welcome Dana to start the framing.
Great, thanks, Ivona. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I think that's up. You able to see that? Great. Yes. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. I'm really excited to be able to share this report with you. It's been out for a couple weeks now, but this is kind of our moment to spotlight some of the findings. And so let's jump into it. So I wanted to start out by sharing how we're defining e-bikes in the context of this report. So we are looking at e-bikes that are electrically powered 2- or 3-wheeled cycles. These are compatible in terms of size and maximum speed with pedal bicycles. So we're mostly looking at e-bikes that are similar in size and shape to pedal bicycles, that kind of fit in with pedal bicycles in bicycle infrastructure. And so we're looking at sort of lower speed e-bikes that typically have a maximum speed around 25 kilometers an hour. And we're not just looking at personal e-bikes in this report. We also include e-cargo cycles as well. And then just on the flip side, we're not talking about higher speed, higher power vehicles like mopeds or other motorized 2-wheelers. So for this report, we did a number of interviews with ITDP staff and with external experts working in the e-bike and larger bicycle space. We interviewed folks in Europe, China, India, Indonesia, East and South Africa, Australia, Brazil, and the US. I think that's all of them. And so from those interviews, we were able to gather a really global understanding of how e-bikes are being used, where, and what the potential for growth looks like. So on this slide, you can just see how we started to group some of these locations and the types of markets that we're looking at the present. So obviously China and Europe having the most developed e-bike markets where supply is really widespread. It's easy to access a lot of different types of e-bikes. There's a strong used e-bike market and availability of parts for repair. And we're seeing e-bikes being used more and more in commercial delivery settings in these places as well. Then we have the sort of emerging markets, the US, Brazil, Australia. These are places where personal e-bike use is growing. And we're seeing a need for more clarity around classifying and regulating e-bikes as sort of separate categories from private vehicles and from pedal bicycles. And supply and different types of e-bikes in these places are growing. And then we have the nascent markets, places like Indonesia, India, Rwanda, and Uganda, where there's a smaller market share of e-bikes, and use is pretty limited by lack of supply, but we are seeing some emerging startups and entrepreneurs who are looking to fill these gaps in supply. And then just taking a look at the larger market potential for e-bikes, looking at the global e-bike market in 2022, around $37 billion US. That's about 15% of the global market for all electric vehicles, and some estimates showing pretty significant growth potential for the e-bike market by 2030, estimating around 120 billion US. And then just looking a little bit more closely at a specific market in the US, again, some really strong growth between the years of 2019 and 2021. Obviously, the pandemic and the really strong growth in demand for bicycles more broadly influenced these numbers, since there was a lot of growth and interest for e-bikes as part of that as well. But some really interesting numbers showing growth, especially from 2019 to 2020. And I think interesting to note that in 2020 and 2021, e-bike imports were actually higher than electric vehicle imports. So we looked in the report as well at the potential impacts of large-scale uptake of e-bikes across the locations where we were interviewing folks and gathering data. And we found some strong support for e-bikes and their impacts on the climate, on economies, and on access. So e-bikes, because they can facilitate longer distance trips with lower effort compared to pedal bicycles, they tend to be a closer substitute for private vehicles. And so that opens up a lot of opportunity for emissions reductions and pollution reduction with substituting e-bikes for cars and internal combustion engine two-wheelers. So we estimated with a large scale uptake of e-bikes by 2050, potential to lower emissions from passenger transport by 400 megatons a year, which is about the size of the UK's total CO2 emissions. So pretty significant opportunity for emissions reduction as e-bikes, especially as e-bikes are substituting for higher polluting private vehicles. And then that large scale uptake and increase in demand has some interesting, presents some interesting opportunities for economic development, thinking about potential for local production of e-bikes and just expanding the production potential of e-bikes outside of the places that they're being produced currently. And then some interesting opportunities for access as well. E-bikes, there's a lot more interest in e-bikes compared to pedal bicycles from groups like women and families and older adults, people who may not be as interested in using a regular pedal bicycle, but because of the opportunities that e-bikes provide with carrying goods, carrying extra passengers, covering trips with lower effort, there's some interesting access opportunities for, especially for previously underserved groups. So a lot of the conversations that we had as part of the scoping and data gathering for this report brought us to understand a number of barriers that are preventing this large-scale e-bike uptake, and thereby preventing cities from benefiting from those impacts that I was just talking about. So we wanted to really clearly define these barriers and then have that inform our recommendations, which we also include in the report. So I'm going to go really quickly through these barriers, and I hope we can dig a little bit deeper into them in the discussion portion of this webinar and offline as well. So the first barrier is streets and policies prioritizing vehicles. I don't think this is surprising to anyone. This is a barrier to cycling more broadly. But essentially, if we don't have safe spaces for people to ride e-bikes, they're not going to consider replacing vehicle trips. They're not going to consider using e-bikes on a daily basis, even if we address some of these other barriers that I'll mention around affordability and storage and battery and charging safety and that sort of thing. So we really need to tackle this this issue of having safe spaces for people to ride bikes and e-bikes. So that looks like a network of interconnected, protected cycle lanes, low-speed streets, and secure bicycle parking. Second barrier is limited supply, high cost, and legacy market for competing modes. In a lot of places, e-bikes are certainly more expensive to purchase than a traditional pedal bicycle, but we also heard that e-bikes can be more expensive than even a motorized two-wheeler in many places because there's just such a low supply of e-bikes. And so that's leading to higher costs. We're also seeing competing modes like motorized two-wheelers and even private vehicles are, subsidized. They benefit from economies of scale, allowing for, less expensive purchase prices and easier access compared to the sort of emerging e-bike market. And this is the case for personal e-bikes and commercial e-bikes. So it has been challenging to find cargo cycles, electric cargo cycles that can be used to carry heavier loads of goods. And those are also expensive in places where supply is pretty low. Unclear classification for e-bikes. I think Angi's going to talk a little bit more about this, but essentially classification of what an e-bike is and how it's classified in vehicle codes can vary pretty greatly from place to place. In this table, you can see kind of different sort of category elements of defining like what an e-bike is and how it's classified. But I just wanted to note kind of more broadly that having this unclear classification actually does have impacts on the market and on enforcement. So, there's potential for customers and potential riders to be confused by these unclear classifications if people don't think they're going to be able to ride an e-bike on off-street trails or in bicycle infrastructure. They may be less likely to purchase one. If they think they're going to need a special license or registration, and there's confusion around that, they may just kind of avoid thinking about purchasing an e-bike at all. And then on the flip side of that, retailers may not stock e-bikes because of low consumer demand stemming from this confusion. And then it can be difficult to enforce regulations if it's unclear where e-bikes are supposed to be ridden, what differentiates an e-bike from a motorized two-wheeler, and which of those can be ridden in bike infrastructure, for example. 4 is e-bikes perceived, taxed, and regulated as luxury goods. Essentially, we see in some places regulators kind of viewing e-bikes as recreational items and therefore being taxed at a higher rate compared to even conventional bicycles. So there's some opportunities to revisit some of the way that e-bikes are taxed on import that can help with supply and with affordability. Secure storage and theft prevention. This comes up a lot when we're talking about e-bikes. Obviously, an e-bike is a more expensive item than a conventional bicycle, and so people want to be extra careful about where they're parking their e-bike. And traditional bike parking typically is not secure enough to accommodate e-bikes, or space sort of efficient enough to accommodate e-bikes, and that can cause a lot of problems with having a place to park if you're riding an e-bike to a destination. E-bikes and batteries can be targets for theft. A lot of people know that e-bikes are more expensive, batteries are more expensive, and that can draw people to think about stealing them. And it's also advised that e-bikes are stored in covered and dry locations because of the batteries. So that can be really difficult for people who are living in dense places, in small apartments. It can be hard to store an e-bike inside, and so that opens up a need for outdoor storage options that are kept dry. And there are some pilots that are emerging around this point in the bottom right image on this slide. There's some companies that are emerging that are piloting some sort of in-street storage options for bikes and e-bikes to try to get at this issue. Safety, of course, is a big one with e-bikes, in particular, sort of the role of e-bikes in crashes. And I think it's important to kind of differentiate some of the different pieces of this complicated puzzle, which is looking at all crash rates, looking at serious crash rates, and looking at crash rates between bicycles and pedestrians. Overall, e-bikes and conventional bicycles have about the same crash risk. For e-bikes, balance problems and maneuverability problems can cause kind of single person crashes at a higher rate. But on the whole, not seeing e-bikes contributing to more crashes than conventional bicycles. In places where e-bike use is growing, we are seeing more instances of e-bikes coming into contact with pedestrians, and that obviously indicates a need for, again, separated spaces for e-bikes to be ridden in cycle infrastructure in the street and not on sidewalks or in places where pedestrians are. And then lastly, charging and battery handling. E-bikes are a lot easier to charge than larger electric vehicles like electric cars and electric buses. You just plug an e-bike into a wall outlet or take the battery off and plug that in. And batteries for e-bikes, the technology is getting better, and things like range anxiety are, I think, less of a concern. I think the bigger concern around charging and battery handling for e-bikes is around battery fires. And we've seen some headlines, I'm sure, from New York and Australia and China even, where there's a lot of e-bikes around lithium-ion battery fires, and there's a real need for regulation and standards around batteries to make sure that high-quality batteries and high-quality chargers are being used for not only personal e-bikes, but e-bike fleets and e-bikes used in delivery fleets and that sort of thing as well. So lastly, I just want to call out a couple of recommendations. There are a number of recommendations we include in the report. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to go through these kind of top 4 that I think address a number of the challenges that are really kind of significantly preventing this uptake of e-bikes. So the first is developing a definition for e-bikes and their use. We recommend national governments taking this up so that there's a common definition and regulation for e-bike use nationwide, as opposed to differences from city to city or place to place within a country. This is really just about defining these different characteristics of what makes an e-bike, and especially what separates e-bikes from higher speed, higher power motorized two-wheelers. And then the other piece of this, separate or in addition to the definition, is really identifying where those e-bikes are permitted to ride, and making it clear that e-bikes, low-speed e-bikes, can use bicycle infrastructure, can use things like off-street trails, but can also ride in the street like a conventional bicycle. Improving affordability of e-bikes. E-bikes are still unaffordable in a lot of places, and we've seen some success with things like purchase incentives. So these are programs where city or national governments are providing vouchers or rebates for the purchase of an e-bike or an e-cargo bike, helping to bring down that purchase cost and improve access to e-bikes for more people. The other piece of this is looking at those import tariffs and thinking about ways to reduce the tariffs that are really inflating the cost of importing e-bikes, and parts as well. So that can help to bring down ultimately the purchase cost as well. Funding and building cycle infrastructure, of course, getting at that #1 barrier around feeling secure riding an e-bike or riding a pedal bicycle. So thinking about planning and designing and financing a network of bike lanes and other supportive infrastructure like parking and bike share that bring more people to e-bikes. And then increasing access to shared e-bikes. I want to be able to talk about e-bike share as a big opportunity for accessing e-bikes. We've seen e-bikes integrated into public bike share programs in a number of major cities in the US and in other places as well. This is a really good way to introduce e-bikes to people who maybe have never ridden an e-bike before without having to think through all of these other challenges around affordability and storage. Bike share systems that have integrated e-bikes have seen really high use of e-bikes. They're used at a much higher rate than the conventional bicycles in bike share systems, even though the e-bikes tend to make up a smaller share of the fleet. And we've also seen some interesting programs, partnerships between bike share companies and local delivery companies that are aiming to replace delivery by private vehicle and give people access to e-bikes, to e-bike share bikes to use for local delivery as a way to expand access and lower emissions. So that is where I will end. There's a QR code here that'll take you to the report. I think Ivona also dropped a link to the report in the chat. There's a lot more in there that I encourage you to take a look at that we aren't going to be able to talk about today. But I will wrap it up there. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana. Yes, you can go ahead and unshare. Thank you. And I'll invite Anggi to talk about the situation in Indonesia.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks, Ivona and Dana. So, well, yeah, actually, to respond to Dana's presentations, actually, it's already well said that all the things happen for this kind of like trends, and it's also coming and growing in Indonesia. From our study, actually, in 2018, we understand that this kind of like the e-bikes, the accession of e-bikes can be the very huge opportunity, since like when we work with the people who live in the urban village, we call it kampung kota, so number of the villagers but they are happened in the cities context. They tend to, especially for the women and children, they tend to choose bikes over other kind of like modes, just because of the other kind of like option for the private modes are not accessible for them in terms of affordability and kind of like in a jet perspective kind of things. So bikes are kind of like really, really close and have an opportunity to work with the vulnerable groups mobility within the neighborhood area. And the existence of the e-bikes itself, based on our recent study, it also can boost the participation of women and people with disabilities in certain of cases for joining the economic contribution or more kind of like jobs, just because they can like rent bike or e-bikes and they can do kind of like commercial or economic activities to work and deal with. And it will also help them to join the ride-hailing ecosystem as well. So in Indonesia, actually, we haven't had that kind of like really good situation in terms of regulation. So most of the markets open. So most e-bikes are coming in from outside of Indonesia. They are manufactured outside of Indonesia, most of them coming from China. And then they come in and then they sell it very, very affordable, cheap price, and it's accessible for everyone. So the issues arise from this kind of like trend is that so many users are children and also women itself. I mean, like for the children here, it's because of Indonesia, we haven't had this kind of like very strong and clear regulation about the definition of e-bikes. So people tend to describe the e-bike as a moped, as you can see in this kind of like picture. So the road safety issues arise just along the way the e-bikes trend coming into the residential areas. So most of the kids that they cannot like have the driving license, and also they may not have this kind of like a very stable ability to drive the motorbikes, they will choose this kind of like e-bike. So looking for this kind of like issues, we tend to work with the Ministry of Transportation to tackle more bigger issue, because it happens in most of our secondary cities. We work with the Ministry of Transport just like to understand and give more kind of like clear classification and how to define the e-bikes. Because of like nowadays, if you see with these pictures, we really go to define e-bikes, as Dana mentioned, as a pedal assist bike, as you can see for the first, the left side of the pictures. But then what happened here in Indonesia, most of our e-bikes can be illustrated with the second kind of like picture. So we are really worried if this kind of like market just like grow big, and it may give more kind of like confusions and also more kind of like conflicted issues and problematic situation in Indonesia, and it will like bring down the good side of the e-bikes itself. So what we are doing actually at this time is want to have this kind of like a very clear situation and how we want the e-bikes can be defined, because it will lead also on how the government can put more kind of like wise subsidy and more kind of like very good incentives for the manufacturers, the local one, to support the assistance of the pedal assist e-bikes, just because of now that we have, because of more kind of like the situation here in Indonesia, when the government, the national government, want to push the infrastructures kind of thing. So to support more kind of like the transition to the electrification modes. So they tend to give the subsidy to the motorbikes, e-motorbikes, and also e-cars instead of e-bikes. And these kind of like situation lead to more people go with the e-motorbikes or e-moped, as the second drawing that you have seen before, go in the market widely, but it's not that kind of like we want to. So we want to put this kind of like regulation can be adopted very soon, because it will also lead not only to the manufacturers, it will not also affect the situation of how the government should like give the subsidy to, but it will also lead on how we want to define the other issues on road safety, just because we want to have this kind of like very clear as well on street who can drive in which side of the street. So because we want to make sure that this kind of like clear definition will lead to a very, very clear and safe situation. But the interesting thing here, we are not only use this kind of like approach, the trend and this kind of like momentum to work on the personal e-bikes, but we really tend to help the cities, the officials to work on and develop more kind of like their plan to adopt the existence of the e-bike sharing. Just because of maybe as Dana mentioned, it's not kind of like we are pretty much familiar with this kind of like the e-infrastructures just because of we have very, very little number of the e-bikes or e-motorbikes or e-carts and e-buses. But just because of we have this kind of like trend to grow and we want to build more kind of like a very complete network, well-connected infrastructures and networks for the modes, so e-vehicles. So we really want to push the e-bikes to take a place as introduction phases. So it will be kind of like a transition that we can see from the motorbikes, the conventional motorbikes, to the e-bikes first, and later on we'll go to the bikes. So this kind of like behavior stated by the women we work with these ride-hailing companies in Indonesia, and they tend to shift just because of if these kind of like e-bikes, the existence of e-bikes can be affordable for them. Just because now in Indonesia, the local manufacturers, the local company, they can produce, but the price is very, very expensive compared to the one produced from outside of Indonesia, which come in Indonesia, and it's not the e-bikes, the pedal assist one, but the moped. So the situation is a bit complicated. So that's why we try so hard to work on this kind of like regulation, just to make this kind of like transition to e-bikes not go into any wrong direction. So really, I think that's kind of like a recent response and also updates coming from Indonesia. Back to you, Ivona.
Thank you so much, Anki. You definitely gave us a lot of food for thought and further questions. But let's hear from Christine from ITDP Africa office to talk about the few cities she wanted to highlight for you all. Hello, Christine.
Thanks, Ivona. Let me share my screen just a second. Okay, so for the Africa context, we have a number of startups, over 18 startups that exist, and these are accelerating the shift to e-mobility, 2- and 3-wheelers, and this action definitely aligns well with what the different governments in different cities are doing in enabling policies and regulatory frameworks. And existing statistics do indicate that over half of these startups already have e-bicycles, or rather e-bikes, and which is about 150 of that as of 2023, and they are rolled out into development, and we have about 22% of these startups into various modes in research and development, and we have about 16% of these that are deployed with more than 400 bicycles. 11% of that are into rapid market expansion with about 150 to 400 bicycles, and this is still as of 2023. But still, as you can see in that map, they are spread out, but nevertheless, in the business as usual scenarios, we have e-bikes that are serving as modes for courier services in cities like Kampala and Nairobi, and ITDP has been supporting these e-bikes, and through projects, of course, like Solutions Plus, which is a global platform that's quite enabling to these startups, supporting them up through research and through pilot projects and development interventions. And we've been supporting the e-bikes projects, yes, through Solutions Plus, and we've done a couple of pilots, like the one for e-bikes for delivery of medical supplies in Dar es Salaam. And then we're also seeing the startups of local e-bikes assemblies through startups like EB in Nairobi, and we also have that in Kampala. So for that, these are just samples of the different e-bicycles that we have out there. Kigali is more of a nascent city in terms of e-bikes, and with the existing operators, that's Gura, they're considering uptake of e-bikes in their system as well. Nevertheless, that's in Kampala, and we're just trying out some of the e-bikes by EB, which is a local operator here, and they also have branches in Nairobi, and they're also picking up in Rwanda and the different cities in East Africa. Sorry. Yeah, so with that, definitely there are challenges when you interact in our interaction with these suppliers. There are challenges that they face, starting with the issue of infrastructure. Just like the conventional bikes, most of our cities in Africa still struggle with cycling infrastructure being an issue to make it seamless for the cyclist or even for the deliveries to be made. So that's something that government can definitely prioritize on together with the funders. And then the purchasing price, like some of my colleagues have already touched on that, that's also still an issue. The initial cost is definitely high compared to the conventional bikes. And that also depends on the policy that's on ground. If it's not favorable, then the suppliers are deemed to take up the high cost for the e-bikes. And similarly, there's the cultural perception, of course, just like the conventional bikes, different cities perceive cyclists differently. If they see a lady on a bike, that may be different in a different city. It may be picking up in Kampala, but say in Gambia, it may be different. In maybe Senegal, it may be different. So there's also that perception, but then that touches on communication. With consistent communication, that also improves eventually. And then the issue of policies and regulations is still a big challenge. And yeah, so with that, the challenges are present, but then they also present opportunities for scaling up e-bikes, where cities and funders and governments and users and suppliers can come together and to see an upscale in the different regions in Africa. Over to you, Ioana.
Great, thank you so much. You can go ahead and unshare. So we have a number of questions here in the Q&A. Please feel free to add some more as we go along. We may have time for a few, but I will start with this question about affordability. I know you spoke a little bit about some examples and the need of making the e-bikes more affordable, both to purchase and to rent. So can you just, each one of you maybe summarize how to enable the wider access and making them affordable, whether maybe it's incentives or working with private industry? You touched on this a little bit, so maybe we can just like sum it up in terms of what you see in research and in your regions as well. So maybe we start with Dana.
Yeah, sure. So we've seen some good models of, like I mentioned, some purchase incentive programs in the US and in Europe mostly. Some of these are at the city level, some of them are at higher levels of government. And these really exist to lower the purchase cost of an e-bike or an e-cargo bike. Some of these came into play during the pandemic and have kind of continued on. But I think the problem with a lot of these programs is that there just isn't the budget isn't large enough, and so the You know, the vouchers or the rebates are taken up really quickly. And, you know, then the program has to wait, you know, another year to, and hopefully continue to have funding to offer more of those incentives. So that's a good sign that people are really interested in buying e-bikes and accessing these incentives, but, you know, it's not necessarily, you know, a long-term kind of solve for this affordability question. So I think that other things that could help is building up like used markets for e-bikes and parts, which we don't really see very much outside of the developed markets in Europe and China. Obviously used e-bikes and parts are more affordable than buying new. And just more supply in general would help to bring some of the purchase costs down. If there's more types of e-bikes at different price points, you know, there's more affordability at the lower end of the range. So these are all, you know, things that can be addressed by different stakeholders. Some of this, you know, some of the purchase incentives come from the government. Some of the supply side is going to come from the private sector. So it's really important for all of these stakeholders to kind of understand the landscape and start to work more closely together to, you know, to deliver more affordable e-bikes.
Great. Christine or Angie, do you want to pick on that?
I want to add a little bit related with the e-bike sharing. So from our latest discussion, it's also really interesting when we are talking to this kind of like matters with one of our BRT operators and also its feeders, just because they think the existence of the e-bike sharing will be a competitor for the feeders that may cover for the last 3 to 5 kilometers to the BRT stations. But the interesting thing is that when we are try to formulate about the price, the fare, the tariffs, and then we make it as not the ATP, WTP, ATP, WTP kind of like study, we do kind of like approach more, look into the giving more percentage from the public transportation fare compared to the ride-hailing one. So it cannot be cheaper than the public transportation fare, but it should be cheaper than the ride-hailing services. So that's kind of like strategy that we do. And we want to do the pilot so we can really see the business scheme and models that can be offered to the private sector, just because we want to make it as a B2B model, and it may work for the city, especially for the Jakarta one.
Thanks for pointing that out, Angie. That's certainly important to talk about the relationship of fare to fare, right? As part of the bike share e-bike system. Christine, do you have some thoughts about improving affordability or access to bikes through affordability?
Yes, I will have an input on that. When I feel like, well, the price may be high, but compared to the conventional bikes, but I'll start from the perception of the public. Because yes, I may be having an e-bike myself, and I know the price, maybe the market range, but not all the different users in Africa, maybe some, unfortunately, I've not even heard that e-bikes are actually in the market. There's also that awareness. So that alone is, so they just perceive, oh, if it's an e-bike, it's expensive. So there's that gap. But then also there's, yes, everyone has touched on tax incentives. We've seen a scenario whereby we have incentives for maybe cars, or we have incentives for maybe other modes, but e-bikes are normally left out for these tax incentives, especially if the city does not have a holistic framework, or it doesn't have a policy that categorizes all the different modes. So that is still a challenge. So I feel like when some of the exemptions are made, maybe like VAT or import duty exemption or excise duty exemption or withholding tax for all vehicle categories, not just maybe cars, but even e-bikes as well. I feel like the prices for these e-bikes can eventually really go down compared to like the e-cars. Yeah, then definitely if there's a firm policy on ground and a framework on ground, that definitely will also influence the price. And then also, and maybe a mini touch on the PPP, I feel like if we have scenarios, maybe the case of, I'll give the case of Kampala. Sometimes you'll find that these startups, just as an effort to bring down the price to some of their clients, they will link them up with financials that can eventually give out probably loans to bring the prices down. They've gone to that level, but that's also because maybe they started from a point when there was no a firm framework on ground to support the leasing price they give to their clients. Yeah.
Gotcha. And feel free to follow up on each other's responses. I think there are a lot of similarities, but also differences between different regions and what we see globally. So we can have the conversation going. But I wanted to switch the questions, and maybe after that we'll go back to policy and planning. But there are two questions that I was actually expecting about battery safety from Margarita and Zvi. And they are talking about how there is a growing concern about batteries catching fire. For example, we see operators, facilities, landlords banning the electric mobility devices from accessing. So what are some of your ideas to ensure we both address the battery safety, but also continue being able to e-bikes in the system, or store them in buildings and so on? So what would be your answer to that, considering quality or regulation or even land use? And whoever is ready to pick that up.
Maybe I'll just start kind of broadly. This is definitely a challenge, and as more and more people own and use e-bikes, this is something that we need to make sure it isn't happening, at all. There have been some efforts around creating standards for e-bike batteries and e-bike, frames more broadly. Which can be enforced through on the manufacturer side, so making sure that manufacturers are producing bikes and batteries up to these standards, and also on kind of the retail side, so people know that they're purchasing an e-bike that's up to a certain standard, and so that just takes understanding and adopting those types of quality standards, which are in place for many other types of vehicles and items. And then there's also just some interesting on the kind of like the storage and charging side of things. In China, where obviously many people have e-bikes, a lot of buildings don't allow you to bring residential buildings don't allow you to bring an e-bike into the building, but some companies are piloting like charging stations outside of buildings. So it's like a cabinet where you can plug in your battery and charge it in kind of this almost like a phone charging station that you would see at like an airport or something like that. And so you park your bike normally, and then you have the battery kind of in this cabinet. And that's kind of an opportunity for private sector to also get involved and provide that service. So there's some interesting like models that are emerging to try to get at this issue as well.
Thanks so much. Any reactions from Christine or Deliani to that one, the safety issues?
I think Dan has given the broad perspective, but I feel like on the micro perspective, I think it touches down to training right from when I buy the e-bike. If it comes maybe with a manuscript of some sort, so I know what I'm dealing with, what say if there are temperature levels that say I should not set my bike in because then the battery should not go beyond that level, more so if it's inside a building. But then that's how far or what the best I can do as a personal owner of an e-bike. But if it's public, then it touches on the provision of the bike infrastructure. If there are convenient bike stations that are situated, like Dana has said, that are situated either besides building at convenient locations, then yeah, that can work. Alternatively, I think the owners of the buildings, I think then that goes back to the regulations. If that is specifically indicated, then the buildings that are coming up or those that are already existing and they're taking up these stations, then these measurements can be put in place.
Thanks, Christine. And actually, that's an excellent point. There was a conversation here going on in the chat about the safety for preventing theft, but I think that is a little bit connected to safety in general, battery related. If we consider, space to park those bikes safely, just as we create spaces for cars, right? Like, why not having designated spaces for regular bikes and e-bicycles? So I think that's a great answer, Christine. So let's go back to talking about policy. You all touched a little bit on the infrastructure needs and kind of like thinking about e-bikes as part of the mobility ecosystems. But we still see cities that are, while there's an uptake in e-bikes, they're not necessarily thinking about integrating e-bicycles into mobility plans. Or sustainable urban mobility plans, depending on the region, or transport plans. So what should the cities be thinking about, right? As they're already grappling with this uptake of e-bikes, but they do not have this regulation in place. Who's ready? We can go in the same order if that's easier.
Yeah, that's okay. I can start. Yeah, well, we reviewed some kind of high-level electrification plans and like e-mobility plans as part of the report, and e-bikes are really not included in these plans. They're really focused on electric vehicles and to some extent electric buses. But e-bikes are largely absent from these kind of visionary plans around electric mobility in cities. And, we think that that's a big oversight, and there's a lot of opportunity to think about the role of e-bikes in our transport networks as a substitute for vehicles, but also to enable a lot of kind of mid-distance trips that people might not be taking because they don't have access to a way to get there. So yeah, so I think that there is a lot of opportunity there, especially as cities are starting to think about these types of plans, and just thinking about broader than electric vehicles, electric cars and trucks, to think about e-buses and e-bikes. I think Christine brought up a good point about how incentive structures are typically available for electric vehicle purchases, but not for bikes. Those budgets that I talked about that are limited, they go a lot farther, providing a share of an e-bike versus a share of a vehicle. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and thinking about how best to integrate e-bikes into these kind of broader plans is something that ITDP is looking into, and I'm sure others are as well.
Thanks so much, Dana. And we're both we're talking both about kind of like the wider scale, whether it's e-bike share or personal use. I think there was a concern here that maybe we're talking solely on about personal use, but I think like as we're thinking about ecosystem, of course, we are also talking about bike share and making sure that everyone actually could have access to e-bicycles, whether it's for purchase or rented. Any other reactions here? I think we have just a couple of minutes to wrap up this question. Christine or Angie?
Yeah, I think I agree and similar with Anna, and also kind of like the comments in the chat box, just like because of we understand in our side, in our cities, Indonesia, we look into this kind of like movement as a part of momentum to shift people from the private vehicles to more sustainable vehicles. So when the discussion's coming, brother, not only talking about the e-buses, but also e-two-wheelers and three-wheelers, we are expanding our landscape to specify and want to pursue for a clear definition on e-bikes. And even we put this kind of like within the new regulation, the possibility on having cargo bikes within this kind of like a to this kind of like landscape. And just because we use this kind of like as momentum, and people, if we just like rely on this kind of like the ownership to the individual, so that's why we look this opportunity as a way for the government to boost the participation of the citizens from the bike sharing system. So that's why we rather go with the e-bikes, though the challenges are still there. The operators maybe are not similar with this kind of like local produce pedal assist bikes. They tend to have the mopeds type of the e-bikes, but still this kind of like opportunity is big, and it will lead to something that can be used and cultivated as a way to shift.
That's very beautifully said, Angie. And anything from Christine, and after that, I'll just wrap up the webinar.
I think I'll circle it back to a bit of capacity building or capacity development for the different government agencies that actually develop these roadmaps, and unless in a situation whereby development partners come in handy and they help them develop the roadmaps or the SAMs. But if it's upon the government itself, and it's a situation whereby they may be aware of it, but there's no thorough capacity building as far as e-mobility that considers electric bike is concerned. So maybe a bit of that might also help. And then in a situation whereby it's there, then maybe facilitating the development of that e-sector, or it may not be, it would be overboard for it to just be an e-bike sector on its own, but probably just the e-sector could then be developed further. And then I think planning a safe cycle network will also help, because then the e-bikes are there, the conventional ones are there, but it can only be as good as the infrastructure that's on ground to make it seamless, be it for courier services, be it for personal use. And then, then of course, extending the FICO incentives, the financing bit also has to come in handy. That's it from me.
Thanks so much. This is actually a great wrap up, because you mentioned several things that we've been talking about infrastructure and financing and policy. And I'm glad that we ended on the infrastructure note. I think that's a very important component of expanding access to e-bikes. So with that, I really wanted to thank you all, the entire panel here, of course, Dana, Angie, Christine, for illustrating the situation in different regions. I hope the audience enjoyed this session. As we know, e-bikes are expanding their presence and will continue in cities, and cities need to act in order to harness the biggest potential from e-bicycles. And lastly, I dropped 2 links in the chat for our next webinars. Feel free to register at any point.